Again, thank you everyone for joining me on a virtual tour of cemeteries along and near the Buffalo River in Newton County. This is a virtual tour which allows me to take you to cemeteries I can't take an actual tour group to. I've added 3 to a tour that I have given for the Buffalo River Partners. And so we have to start with a map. The river is the blue wavy line at the top. And we are going to start our tour downstream at Carver and work our way upstream and back over into Boxley Valley, because the most unusual things are down at this one end and I don't want to run out of time. Before we go into Carver Cemetery though, I need to explain why these cemeteries are so important and why they contain things that are so unusual. And it has to do with the fact that prior to the Civil War, about 2/3 of the white settlers who came into the Arkansas Ozarks came from Tennessee and Missouri. But they had other states of origin as well, and they migrated through a number of states getting here. So it's possible to find these same burial customs, traditions in Illinois, Alabama, Mississippi, and Kentucky, to name some of the states. And these things that we're going to be seeing are mostly in the category of grave covers. There are tombstones, but a grave cover is a structure that is built on top of a grave, a structure that took a lot of work and is a whole different tradition. It's a way of defining a grave, but it's not the traditional tombstone, headstone, footstone. So let me just go through some examples of things we're going to be seeing. Grave houses, for example. These are little buildings, wood, stone, metal, brick, that are built over a single burial or multiple burials, and they have no real purpose. They are buildings, but they are not mausoleums. They don't hold a coffin. They don't cover the entrance to a crypt. They are just little buildings, and no one really knows why they were built. But at one time, cemeteries in the Arkansas Ozarks were filled with them, and they've disappeared. They've fallen down, been torn down, and so forth. But there is anecdotal evidence and some physical evidence that there were once a lot of these little buildings. And we'll get to more examples later. Something else are called combs. That's C-O-M-B. And a comb is like a little stone pup tent that covers the length of a grave. Short ones for children, long ones for adults, sometimes with a triangular end cap to keep the pieces standing. But again, these have fallen down over time, been torn down, taken away, and there were once a lot more of them. Again, the function isn't really known. The word comb may refer to the ridge pole on a house where the roof comes together. It doesn't have anything to do with a chicken's comb. Another example would be a vault.
There we go.
These are empty boxes made of stone, sometimes brick. There's no body inside. They are on top of a grave and may represent a burial chamber. It's hard to say, again, what their purpose was. And then the fourth thing that we're going to be seeing on this tour are cairns. And a cairn is a pile of stones. The stone may be shaped or dressed. It may be laid up in a rectangle or in a pyramid, a triangle, what have you. But again, it fills the top of the grave. Now, there are 3 other things that won't be on this tour, but they're really unusual, and I just need to show them to you. One, these are found around Searcy County, and they're 2 empty boxes stacked one on top of the other. So 2 false crypts on a single grave. And then if you notice the odd shaped triangular headstone that's built into one end, even that is a tradition called a necked discoid that was brought here by settlers. Another thing is a slot and tab tomb. This is more or less a false crypt, a box, with a solid piece across the top with a hole cut in it where a tombstone can be sort of socketed in, headstone, footstone. And then the last example would be a coffin-shaped false crypt. And these are literally the shape of hexagonal coffins with separate lids, sometimes with decorative elements that almost resemble coffin hardware. Again, there's no body in them. Sometimes they're solid blocks of stone, but they represent the coffin that is buried below ground. So they're a memento mori, a reminder of death. So these are some of the examples of things that are not found in city cemeteries for the most part. They're found in the rural cemeteries. And for whatever reason, the cemeteries along the Buffalo River have preserved these, and you can find them there where you can't find them in other parts of the Ozarks. So at this point, let's go into Carver Cemetery, the first stop on our tour. Carver is on Arkansas 123 between Piercetown and Hasty, and right near the Carver canoe launch. You can't see it from the road, and it's named for the Carver family. Although I'd like to think that it was named for a carver who put a lot of work in this cemetery, and we'll get to him in just a minute. If you're going to go to any of these cemeteries on your own, and you would like to do a kind of a scavenger hunt as you go and look for things, some of the things that are in this cemetery that are really interesting are things like this: Susan's Babe. This is for a child named Eulene McHenry, and she's buried next to her mother, who died in 1882. A beautiful little outline of a dove at the top of the stone. Other things to see in Carver: there's a row of tablets that are signed by the two men who carved them, brothers-in-law William Jones and Allen Key. Each one married the other sister, and they made carved a lot of stones in this area. There's a family tree that has an actual tree with children's names on every branch. I think it was done in the 30s, very hard to find, but under a tree. Two modern markers that say slave, put there by a man who remembered being told that there were graves of enslaved people in this cemetery. And then modern markers that have a lot of interesting photos and artwork on them. But the reason I'm starting our tour with Carver Cemetery is because of this stone. It's on the grave of William Mayberry, and it was carved by William Mayberry. And I had the tremendous good fortune to meet a lady in a cemetery who told me the story of this lamb. Her name was Lois McCutcheon, and she died a few years later, but I was in Ben's Branch Cemetery. She was decorating a grave. We started talking, as one does, and she told me about the lamb, and she said, "You need to go see it." She said this was carved by Uncle Bill as a commission. That Bill Mayberry was a professional tombstone carver. And in fact, he put a lot of stones in cemeteries in this area. Ben's Branch, Old Dodson, Sand Hill, Carver, and so forth have examples of his work. But she said the lamb was a commission, and somebody asked him to carve it. But when that person found out that Mayberry was going to charge $150 for it in the 1930s, they backed out of the deal and they refused to accept it. So Mayberry continued working on it and kept it for his own eventual use. The lamb looks like this. It's the size of a sheep, really, and it has metal ears and marble eyes. Lois said to me that Mayberry quarried his own stone, which would make sense because there were outcroppings of rock along the Buffalo and in this area that were highly prized for tombstones. And the stone itself has got little crystals running through it. And she said that at some point the lamb was vandalized and Mayberry's family restored it. So I made the assumption that it must have had ears at one time and they were knocked off by the vandal, and the family put the metal spoons in place of the ears. But I was wrong. About a year ago, Tanette Madison, who is the director of the Boone County Heritage Museum, sent me this picture. And as you can see, something is sticking out of the lamb's head. Those are not carved ears. Those are probably the metal spoons. Lois was a child in the 1930s when she saw Mayberry working on this. So here are the two side by side. You can see them for comparison. And there are other things I could say about this carving, but it is a one of a kind. It is beautifully done. And I'm just so grateful to have met Lois and had her tell me the story of this lamb. So that's my favorite thing ever, but also my favorite thing in Carver Cemetery. So we're going to leave Carver now, and we're going to head down Arkansas 123 to the town of Hasty. Hasty has basically one street opposite the post office, and if you were to turn on that street, you would immediately see a green sign for the Hasty Cemetery. If you go there and in person, be careful. You have to cross a cow pasture. Please be careful and close gates after yourself. I think you have to open and close 2 gates to get back there. But when you do, you will be in a lovely isolated cemetery that has 2 grave houses. These grave houses were a wonderful discovery, and they are, I think, the best documented houses in all of the Ozarks, if not anywhere. If you're interested in grave houses, there's a website called The Grave Walkers, where a man has gone through and put pictures of all the grave houses by state, and you can look at the ones that he has photographed in Arkansas, and he has included these too. But the grave houses cover the grave of an unnamed infant who died in 1910, and an Agee family child, and Guffrey Agee, who died in 1914 at age 2.5. Now, I took these pictures before the houses were restored, which the Agee family does periodically. Again, I had the wonderful good fortune to meet Frank Agee, the family patriarch. I kind of tracked him down. The family lives in Texas now, but they come back to Arkansas periodically, and they do restoration on these houses. And Frank not only, he gave me a lot of information about the houses, and he also told me that he sent me pictures of the houses taken apart as the family replaced rotted pickets with exact replicas. Now, if you notice, I'm using this picture so you'll see what's posted in the window of Guffrey's house, and it is a photograph. And Frank gave me a copy of that photograph, and this is what it looks like. These are the 2 houses when they were newly made, taken probably 1915 or early 1916, Frank thought. The man seated in the little chair on the right was William Newton Christian, and he made both houses using simple hand tools. And the story is that after the houses were finished, he kept a little chair, presumably the one he's seated on. He kept a little chair in Guffrey's house, and at night he would walk over, in the evening, he'd walk over the hill to the family graveyard, and he would take out the chair and be with the babies. He was a Civil War veteran. He is buried behind the 2 houses. And so here's that same photograph, and here are the houses after the most recent restoration. They've been painted and given a new roof. And Frank had told me that this little chair used to be kept there and it was stolen, but either it was returned or another one just like it was put in the house, because that's now in Guffrey's grave house. Another thing about these houses, and here's the Guffrey's house, they're enormously detailed. They have doors that open and close, a drop ceiling, glass windows. But if you notice Guffrey's tombstone, another photo that Tonette Madison sent me from Boone County is a picture from Bill Mayberry's stone yard, and 3 tombstones that he made, all for the Salmon family. But the one in the middle is an almost perfect match for Guffrey's stone. So we know that Bill Mayberry, the maker of the lamb, also carved Guffrey's tombstone. Those 3 stones were, I think, all put in Ben's Branch Cemetery, which is in Bass Valley. And the middle stone has been destroyed or stolen, because the one on either side are still there, and there's a gap in the middle. Apparently, Bill Mayberry liked to use a wax crayon and highlight some of his carving, and Guffrey's stone still shows that crayon highlighting the oak leaves at the top. Just doing a little bit of background on grave houses. As I said, at one time, they were all in cemeteries throughout the Ozarks. There are stories of people sleeping in them, people hiding in them to jump out and scare their friends. There's evidence of the ones, occasionally you can see where there would have been a corner piece. This is in Madison County in Kilgore Cemetery, and I'm not sure that it's even still standing. It was leaning badly when I took this picture a couple of years ago. In the time I've been photographing grave houses, 5 have disappeared. I've gone back to cemeteries to reshoot photos, and 5 are now missing, presumably torn down by caretakers. Grave houses are as unique as the people who made them. There are many different styles. These are just some of the ones: stone pen with roof, garden gazebo, metal fence and uprights, large pen with dirt about waist high, husband and wife buried in that one, upper right-hand corner. I've seen ones that were entirely made of metal, where a family got tired of replacing rotted wood and simply made a new one out of welded metal and so forth. There are not that many left. They do exist in other states, though. Well, moving along the river or down the road, if you were to leave Hasty heading back towards Carver on 123, when you see a sign, a brown, like it's a Forest Service sign, and it tells you the mileage to Jasper, that is the Hasty cutoff. And if you were to turn on that road and go over the new bridge over the Buffalo River, which is a big improvement over the low water bridge that used to be there, as soon as you cross over the Buffalo Bridge, heading towards Jasper, look for a road on your right. It'll show up in less than a quarter mile. And when I say road, I mean 2 tire tracks and a high center. There's no sign, no road number, no name. But if you turn on those 2 tracks, you will almost immediately come out at the Collins-Armstrong Cemetery. In fact, the road will dead end there. Collins-Armstrong, or Armstrong-Collins, is unique in that it has a type of burial cover, grave cover, known as a tiered ledger stone. That's the name the Park Service has given it. And a ledger is a large slab of stone that covers a grave and usually has the person's name and dates carved on it. These do not. It's just known that the Collins and Armstrong families buried there. And as you can see, it's a longer stones for adults and shorter stones for children. And tiered in this name would be tiers like a step or like a wedding cake with the stair steps, topped by a large slab of stone. I don't know of any others that look like this. There may be some in family cemeteries, but this is the only cemetery I know of that has this type of configuration, this type of grave cover. Periodically, a photo of these stones will pop up on Facebook, and someone will state confidently that these are wolf stones, and they were put there to keep wolves from digging up the bodies, which is a lovely Gothic detail, and I really love it, but unfortunately it is not true. I don't doubt that there's something called a wolf stone somewhere, and of course, animals do dig into graves. At one time, people did not embalm, they buried very quickly, they used wooden coffins. There are accounts of animals digging into graves. So it would make good sense if you were burying a body to pile a lot of dirt and a lot of stones and anything you can on top of that grave to protect it. But these stones were an enormous amount of work to make. They had to be chiseled out and hauled in, and you would not put something with this weight on a new grave because over time the grave is going to settle. It's going to drop by a foot or 2. And if you had that kind of a stone on top of a grave, it would drop and you'd have to try and level it out. So the wolf stone story is wrong for that reason. And also because in the Ozarks, there is a very firm taboo against doing anything before a death. So to have a stone like this ready to go on a grave at the time of death, you'd have to have made it in advance, and nobody would risk doing that. If somebody is dying of something, tuberculosis, something that's very recognizable, where there is no hope, there's no cure, there's no therapy, even in those cases, the neighbors who are sitting up and who are helping the family will not make any part of this process easier by doing things in advance. They will wait until the person dies, and then they will sew a shroud, build a coffin, dig a grave. And so it would be unthinkable to make slabs of stone and have them ready when the person is still alive. I would assume that these were made at the same time and by the same person or people because of the similarity in them. Anyway, I do really like this cemetery. There aren't a lot of marked graves. There are a couple of nice pieces of carving, though, folk art carving in them, in the cemetery. Well, moving on, if you follow this road back into Jasper, you come out to Highway 7, take a right on 7 heading north, and turn left on the Irby Road. The Irby Road has got 3 graveyards on it. One is visible beside the road, but the Adair Cemetery is not. And Adair is one I could never take a tour to because you have to know where to park and then walk through the woods by about a mile. And when you get back to the cemetery, it has a wooden fence around it, put there by the Park Service. Adair is a very small cemetery, but it is filled with interesting stones, stones signed by the men who carved them, interesting symbols, interesting grave covers. Probably the most unusual stone in there is the one for William Adair, and it said, died for his country, killed in Limestone Valley, April 18th, 1864. Limestone Valley was quite a ways off to bring a body back. It'd be a long way to bring him. I don't know who carved this stone, but it has crossed guns at the top and a flag that says, or a little banner that says CSA, Confederate States of America. The battle that's referred to here was an attempt to get a guerrilla fighter and his men, and there was an ambush. It's written about by Walter Lackey in his History of Newton County. I don't have the details on it, but there is a little bit that's known about the men who were killed. Other things in this cemetery that are interesting: rest for the weary. I love this marker because of all the farming implements. There's a plow, an axe, a hoe, a shovel. So this man had a lot of things to rest up from. But even though it is a nice tribute to a farmer, there was a grange or a agricultural cooperative about the same time that used all of those tools in their emblem, and that's found on a couple of tombstones in this area. But the reason I'm putting Adair on our tour today is because of John and his wife, Sarah. You can't really tell from this picture, but their graves are covered with a headstone, footstone on either end of a comb, that little stone pup tent that I was talking about. Unfortunately, on Sarah's side, the two sides of the two slabs that should be leaning together have fallen flat. And on John's side, they're starting to pull apart. So it's very hard to see the comb, not to mention the leaves on the ground. But if you were to go to another cemetery in this general area, this is what the combs would look like that have not fallen apart and have been maintained. This is in Valley Springs in Boone County, but both Valley Springs and Holmes Cemetery in Belafonte have a lot of examples of combs, ones for children, and ones such as this, where you have a comb on top of a false crypt. So an empty stone box with a stone pup tent on top. The sides are decorated, and then there's a headstone at one end, which is broken, but a headstone and a footstone. So an enormous amount of construction that went on top of this one grave. This is Holmes Cemetery, and it has a lot of other combs, little ones that are just flat on the ground. So if you're interested in those burial customs, you can find a lot around the Buffalo River, but a lot of them also over in Boone County and into Searcy County. I took this picture in Tuscaloosa coming back from a gravestone studies conference, and I'm putting this in here to show you, as I said, these customs all come from other places. They don't originate in Arkansas. Jim and I were coming back from gravestone studies. We saw a cemetery, hadn't had our fill. Tombstones by that point stopped and didn't even see the combs from the road. These are massive. They were long enough that two people, I think, could lie end to end, and it would be longer than the two people. I saw one comb there for a 17-year-old boy, so they were not really relative to the size of the people. They were all huge, and even those are falling apart. I don't know the dates. I'm not sure that the headstones are even legible. But behind this big comb is another false crypt. There's the empty box, the sides fallen away, but the same two covers the false crypt and the comb in one cemetery in Alabama. Well, moving along the Irby Road, when you come to, well, it's not really the end of the road comes on, but the road kind of comes out and stops right in front of the Parker Hickman homestead, which has been preserved by the park, and all the buildings are intact, and there's a fence around it. If you open the fence and drive inside the yard and drive behind the buildings, you will come out to a little road that goes into the woods and a sign that says Cherry Grove Cemetery, 1.1 miles. And as long as you don't have a tree across the road, you can drive straight back to the cemetery and the road will end there. It is an incredibly lovely place. It's hard to do it justice for these pictures because the stones are so shaded by large trees. It's an interesting place because it shows the work of several carvers, men who did not sign their stones, one man who did and several who didn't. So you have an interesting mixture of some professionally carved stones from the 1880s, let's say, and ones that are extremely primitive and very beautiful. Of all the stones in the cemetery, if people know Cherry Grove, they probably know this marker. It says, well, let me just elaborate. It has a row of books carved across the top, and it says, in memory of Joseph M. Buchanan, was born April the 9, 1827, was killed by Confederates March the 5, 1864, whilst in the service of the National Army as a recruiting officer. I've never found any other information about Joseph Buchanan, but he has a very elaborate stone, and the row of books across the top are all Bibles. One says the Holy Bible, the New Testament, the Holy Book. Whoever carved this stone did other stones down in Bass Valley, because Old Dodson Cemetery has several that have rows of books carved across the top. So this stone tells you how this man died, and it's the only one in the cemetery with that kind of information. But this, as I said, there were carvers working here who did very primitive work and really beautiful work. A number of them are involved doves. One, I think, says, "Oh, holy dove, return," over the top. These are like just some of my favorites: a heart, a feather, a rose, a couple of pulleys, perhaps, the lamb, and so forth. Beautiful work. I wish whoever had made these had signed them. These are obviously the work of different carvers. But there was one carver whose work in here is signed, and he happens to be a tombstone carver I am obsessed with. His name was Nick Miller. He was German. He came to this country when he was a teenager. He had no family. He never married. He first shows up, I can find him in the early 1870s when he becomes an American citizen in Bentonville. He gets American citizenship. And he then moved all over the Ozarks. He would stay long enough to carve up a backlog of orders. He was carving tombstones for deaths before he was even born. But he came into Cherry Grove, possibly with apprentices. He would work his way across the country. He would need help. He would teach young men to carve in exchange for room and board and for a useful skill, tombstone carving. And so we can see him coming into an area, and then we can see the work of other people, other men who signed their stones. You can kind of see his typefaces and some of his symbolism. All of these symbols are in Cherry Grove, and these are all stones that are signed by Nick Miller. The dove has a bud in its beak, which is the life that will open in heaven. The broken bud on the left represents death. That bud will not open in this world, a lamb, and so forth. Nick Miller fascinates me because his work is everywhere, but also because he seems to have encouraged his clients to do unusual things, original things on tombstones. So while he carved the standard symbols of his day, it appears that he would say to a customer, to try and get them to do something different. And one example of that is in Cherry Grove, and it's Nancy Harp's tombstone. If you face the cemetery, she's in the back right corner. And what she has on her stone is a palm leaf fan. Now, you can search books on symbolism for a long time, and you will not find a palm leaf fan. You might find a palm leaf, but not the fan. And all I can conclude, and this is just a guess, is that Nancy Harp owned a palm leaf fan, and then it was her prized possession, and then she was never seen without it. if the family chose this for their mother or their grandmother, it's a way of summing her up. And my guess is that they associated this with her. I've never seen another one. Nick Miller never carved another one that I know of, but it has a little handle. It's got an edge to it. And as I said, he did encourage his clients to do original things. One tombstone has a man's weight 190 pounds. One has 2 ages for a woman, when apparently the family couldn't decide. There are enigmatic one-liners on some of his stones. I wouldn't be surprised if Nancy Harp had been buried with a fan in her hands, because people's possessions often did go into the coffin with them. A child holding a doll, a man's gun or knife or walking stick. So anyway, whatever the story is behind Nancy Harp and her fan, I think it's a one-of-a-kind stone, and it is signed by Nick Miller. Well, if you come back down the Irby Road and come back into Jasper and take a right on Highway 74, now we're going to head down into Boxley Valley. You will go right past the Jasper City Cemetery. Now, it's not on our tour, it's not on the Buffalo River, but if you are doing this tour yourselves in real time, I urge you to stop. Oh, heck, I urge you just to go to Jasper and go to the city cemetery. It is so filled with interesting things. It's the gift that goes on giving. Every time I go there, I find something I haven't seen before. I'm only going to show you one thing, and I'm showing you this because it is so hard to find. Robert Eldridge's little lamb is under a tree, and it's usually in shadow. I got this picture by sprinting across the cemetery and sliding into home base. When the sun came out from behind a cloud, I'd gone there when the leaves were off the tree. But it is under a big tree, and it is hard to see. What I love about this little stone is that it's signed by the carver, and his name was William Jones. There were 2 men named William Jones who carved stone and who signed their work. This is William A. Jones, and he is very hard to find. And this seems to be his early work. But those little leaf tendrils, grapes, whatever on either side is pure Nick Miller. Nick put those on his early work. So all I can conclude is that this man, Mr. Jones, was learning from Nick and imitated those little designs, but I can't prove that. Jasper Cemetery has a number of stones signed by Nick Miller and by the other William Jones. It has 2 lambs and tree stumps where the lambs have got floppy bunny ears. There are several photo ceramics. There is one post-mortem photo ceramic. That is a photograph of a person taken after death, and that photo has been bonded onto a piece of ceramic and attached to a tombstone. Postmortems are incredibly rare in Arkansas. I have found only 9 for the entire state. Now, a friend of mine in Illinois near Chicago has photographed over 100 of them, because at one time it was quite commonplace. You take a picture of the person in their coffin, and then later you have that picture put on the person's tombstone. The one in Jasper is of a child, and her face is turned away from the camera. So you see the back of her head and the pleated fabric of the coffin liner behind her head. So that's something to look for. There are quite a few modern markers that are interesting, including ones with people's pets, and the pet's name is on there, usually dogs, but there's one cow. There's a photo ceramic of a man holding a dog. They're in a recliner. They both look incredibly happy. That's near the entrance. There's a Coke bottle carved on a flower vase on a man's grave. There are pieces of art that show what the deceased loved in life, camping, horseback riding. And then there are epitaphs. And I have to say, I used to be such a snob when it came to modern markers. I didn't think they were worth the time. And later I discovered that that's where the intentional humor is going to be. You want to find something funny, it will be on a new stone. So in the Jasper Cemetery, there are a lot of good epitaphs and one-liners, such as preserve the roses of the living for the, preserve the roses of the giving for the noses of the living. I like that one. And that man is still alive. And then one for a man who has died, and his epitaph is minding my own business. So for all these reasons, the Jasper City Cemetery is an amazing place, and I can't stress enough how much fun it is to go there. But we are moving on and going down into, dropping down towards Boxley Valley, and we're going to stop at Low Gap. Low Gap Cemetery is right there on the highway, opposite a stone building built by the WPA, I think is a school, now used as a church, opposite the Low Gap Cafe. And the cemetery itself has got some folk art carving, some very primitive but really lovely pieces of tablet type stones. It also has two modern markers, and I'm going to let you find those on your own. One has the man's claim to fame. He wrote a song that was made famous by Anne Murray, and the other is for a man who died, and it hints broadly at him that he was murdered, and spoiler alert, he was, but you can find his story online. So those are two modern granite markers. But the reason I put this cemetery on our tour is because of this. I know this talk should have been called Lambs Along the Buffalo River, but this one is, it kind of reminds me of a pig. It's got little pointy ears and a little snout, and I find it utterly adorable. It's one of four, in fact. Two are at Mount Sherman, and one is near Parthenon at Old Union Cemetery, presumably all by the same carver, possibly someone who had never seen a lamb. And I don't mean to sound critical, because I know I couldn't do it. But there are a lot of lambs out there that do not really look like sheep. Here are some examples, just because I'm just so in love with these things. I really think that there were carvers who had never seen a sheep, or who were starting out and maybe their level of skill wasn't that great. I'm not making fun of this. Carving stone must be an incredibly difficult thing. Carvers used a wooden mallet, which is basically a big ball of wood on a stick, and you hold that in your dominant hand, the hand you write with. And then you hold a metal chisel in your non-dominant hand, and you use these two simple tools to carve fleece on a lamb, feathers on a dove, petals on a rose. And I just amazed that people could make stone do that. But not all of them could when they were starting out, and some of them had a little trouble. For example, petals on a rose. All of these pictures were taken in the Arkansas Ozarks, not necessarily next to the buffalo. But I do think that this is a pretty difficult assignment. And petals out of stone would have been incredibly hard. Trust me, these are all meant to be roses. Another example would be weeping willow trees. Not sure we had a lot of weeping willows in the Ozarks. Not sure these carvers had ever seen a weeping willow. Now, I know who carved at least 4 of these, and I know that these men learned to carve from Nick Miller. So it's a little surprising that they were doing such a rudimentary job. Possibly they were looking at a picture or going from a description of a willow, I don't know. But just for contrast, here is how Nick Miller carved weeping willow trees. And you can see it was possible to carve those fronds of a willow out of stone. Nick apparently didn't like to repeat himself. Those are just some of the willows that he did. And one of them, I have seen the probate records for it. He couldn't even get paid for it. It's one of the most detailed pieces of carving he did. And he tried repeatedly to get the $20 he was owed. That stone is in Fayetteville, and he never did get paid. So just for contrast, that is how a professional carver did when carving a willow. Well, moving on, we drop down into Boxley Valley and cross over the Buffalo River, and Highway 43 runs through the valley, and we are going to turn left onto 43 and drive to where there is the sign for Lost Valley. Turn right going towards Lost Valley and immediately watch for a road that doglegs in from the right. That is Beechwoods. I am sorry to say that I lived outside of Kingston for a long time and did not know that Beechwoods existed. It's a beautiful place. It is, you don't see it from the road. It has a very old church. It has some very primitive carvings, some very beautiful carvings on tablets. This is the Arbaugh brothers, Wallace and Jacob. They were not twins. They died a couple of months apart, March and July of the same year. I don't know who carved this stone, but I find it beautiful. There are a number of very beautiful carvings in here. There's also a modern marker for a man where you look at a stone and you just would wish you would know him. His picture is there, and there's an epitaph that says, "How could we forget someone who gave us so much to remember?" When you see his picture, you'll know what that means. There's a lot of interesting things in the cemetery, but I'm including it because at one time it had a grave house. Actually, it had two. I learned from Facebook that at one time there was an infant's grave that had a tiny grave house over it, now long gone. This one this photo was taken in 1978, but it is over the grave of Vesta Valines, who died in 1951, and the house was built by her husband. I really think that was probably still standing when I moved back to Arkansas, and I regret that I didn't get to see it. I don't know why it's gone, if it rotted down or what happened. Here's another picture of the same house taken, I don't know when, but taken at a different time. But if you go there now and stand in more or less the same spot, this is what it looks like. There's Vesta's stone, and obviously the grave house is gone. So again, a lot of interesting things in this cemetery, but I do regret the fact that the grave houses are no longer there. There's I think a modern marker put in the cemetery for Jim Valines, who was Black, and I think somebody just recently marked his grave, but I have not seen that marker yet. Well, leaving Beechwoods and continuing down 43, our last official stop is Walnut Grove Cemetery. Walnut Grove may be one of the most photographed places in Boxley Valley. It has two churches, two very old churches, a cemetery, and church services are still held there. It is a beautiful setting. I have started tours there, but I have to say I've never found anything in the cemetery that I could tell a story about or point to or say this is what's unique and interesting. There are some nice carvings. There is this one grave that has a stone pen around it. There are a number of markers that have the gates ajar symbol and with variations, including a brother and sister who were killed in the 19-teens in an automobile accident. They were speeding, their car flipped over, and they were killed. And they have matching stones with matching death dates. But really, I don't have anything in the cemetery that I can put on a tour. So that covers all of the cemeteries near the Buffalo River. But I want to mention one more, because again, if you were to go here, I wouldn't want you to miss this. If you stay on 43, start climbing up the mountain, you will come to Mossville. And Mossville has a church and a very large cemetery. And Mossville Cemetery is the only cemetery I know of that continues to practice yet another type of grave cover, and that is called scraping and mounding. Every grave in this cemetery is mounded with fresh dirt every year by members of the congregation. A man who goes to church there said that it's done out of respect, and it's done as a reminder, because if every grave looks like a recent one, it reminds the living to get their affairs in order, to live accordingly, to live as though they too could and will die. And so every grave is kept looking fresh, even though a lot of the graves in there are marked with field stones and nobody knows who's buried there. Every grave is decorated on Decoration Day too. This cemetery will be a riot of silk flowers once a year. It's completely covered. Every grave will be marked that way too. Scraping and mounding is an old tradition. It is a grave cover. You can still find this practiced in the Ozarks in individual family plots. So within a defined area, a family will scrape and mound their graves, but the rest of the cemetery will be kept mowed. Or some cemeteries really, they want to be able to mow, so they tell people not to do this. This is, as I said, the only cemetery I know where the entire place is done this way, and they continue to do that. Well, that brings me to the end of my talk, and I'm going to close with one last Nick Miller tombstone. This is here in Springdale, actually, in Friendship Cemetery. Farewell till we meet again. And I'm also giving you my email address. It's abby@madisoncounty.net. If you are out in the cemetery and you see something that you would like to share, I hope you will send me a picture. I am looking for post-mortem photographs. I am looking for tombstones for amputated body parts. And I'm looking for tombstones that have the cause of death on them, the name of a murderer, that kind of thing. Struck by lightning, killed by a falling tree. So please share. But at the same time, I would like to help you if you are working on a project, genealogy, family history, and you come across a stone and would like help interpreting it. For one thing, I can help with the poetry, the epitaphs. I have a lot of them transcribed and I can help read them. If the stone is signed by the carver, I could give you information on that person. But mainly if you have symbols on the stones. At one time, everybody understood what these religious symbols meant, but we have gotten away from this and we've tended to believe our ancestors were literal. And that has caused problems when doing genealogy. For example, the anchor is found on so many tombstones, but I have heard people say, I don't know how grandma managed to be in the Navy when she was on the farm on every census. Well, the anchor, unless it says US Navy on it, the anchor simply means hope. It is the symbol of hope, the hope of heaven, the hope of salvation, the hope that we will see our loved ones again. So it's appropriate for children, infants, all the way up through elderly adults. Anchors don't mean what they appear to mean. And that's true of some other symbols too. But also the symbols of the fraternal lodges can trip people up. We all know the Masons and the Oddfellows, but the Knights of Pythias, but there were so many others. At one time, between the end of the Civil War and the Depression, there were as many as possibly 2,000 different fraternal lodges in this country. And the men's lodges and the women's lodges had symbols that they put on their members' tombstones. So there are some very obscure ones. There are also like trade unions. Men who worked for the railroad could have been a member of the Brotherhood of Railroad Carmen, the Brotherhood of Locomotive Engineers, the Brotherhood of Telegraphers or Conductors. They had their symbols. And then African Americans, in addition to having Black Masons and Oddfellows, had lodges that were uniquely their own, and they had a whole range of unusual symbols. So if you find something on a stone, you want to send me a picture, I can try and help, or you can just send me a description. And again, I would be happy to help. I live for this. So please be in touch, and thank you all for attending this talk. And I think, Susan, we have questions?
Yes, great program, Abby. I hope you can hear all the applause. You're getting many thank yous. Yeah, so we've got time for questions. If y'all would like to stay, please do. So here from Peggy Way wants to know where, and this was two people have asked, where are stones generally signed?
Oh, that is an excellent question. I'm embarrassed I didn't mention this. As you face a tablet, look at the bottom right-hand corner where it comes up against the base. Unfortunately, this is the spot most likely to be damaged by a weed eater, by a stone snapping off, or somebody re-cementing a stone. So a lot of signatures can be lost or damaged, but generally lower right corner, except for the Roseboro Company of St. Louis, which shipped a lot of stones into Arkansas, and they signed lower left. So, but really a signature can show up anywhere, and always check the back of a stone. I have found signatures on the back. And on stones that have stacked bases, I have found signatures on the sides of the base, or even hidden, like a hidden puzzle where they'll have like the person's surname and it'll be tucked in into a corner of a surname. Generally lower right-hand corner is a place to start though.
Very good. Do you have a map and directions available for this tour that you just led us on?
Well, that's why I was trying to give people directions as I went along.
Yes.
We are recording this. And the directions I've just given verbally, the Buffalo, the Park Service has river maps, but I don't know that they show the cemeteries on them. And something like finding the Adair Cemetery, where you have to more or less know where there's a gate, like a locked gate, and you start walking. I can give you a mileage, like turn on the Irby Road and go approximately so many miles. And when you see a gate, walk behind it and head into the woods. I could do that kind of thing. So just contact me.
Okay, very good. Where in Fayetteville is Nick Miller's willow tree carving that he didn't get paid for?
The cemetery, Garing's Chapel, the one that's up behind Christian Life Cathedral, is broken off. It is lying flat. His signature is below the break, part of the base, I think. But you can pick it up, the stone up, and tilt it toward the light and see it has a tiny obelisk hidden under the fronds of the willow. And I forget the man's name. I'm sorry, I'm blanking on whose tombstone it is. It's a fairly thick slab. And if you walk in, there's a parking lot. So you park and then just walk straight into the cemetery. It's in the back right-hand corner and it's lying flat.
Abby, you know these people better than you know a lot of your friends and family, don't you? The dead people.
I have no memory for friends and family. I cannot remember faces. It's embarrassing. When I gave this tour in real time for the Buffalo Partners, the lady named Sybil, I'm sorry, I'm blanking on her name all of a sudden. The lady who was in charge of the program told the audience, she said, Abby never remembers a face and never forgets a tombstone. Because it was so embarrassing that people have been on my tours before and I couldn't remember them, but she was right.
Well, you're kind of sorry to say you're a rock star, which rocks and tombstones. Oh, that's so funny. Oh. Okay, which segues into our next question. Are the gravestones really stone or are they carved concrete? If they're stone, are they from local stone close to the cemetery, or is the stone from elsewhere and used specifically for gravestones?
I think most of the concrete you find are people making their own markers. Concrete was cheap, easily worked with. You could push marbles into it, take a stick and write in it. So concrete would be something family used to make their own markers. As far as stone goes, mostly stone would be quarried near a cemetery if possible. You didn't want to have to haul it in. But that said, all of the early carvers, when they advertised in newspapers, advertised imported Italian marble. So these white tablets, as you see in cemeteries, would have been brought in. And I don't know why that was such a big deal, but you do see white marble, and that would have been imported. When you see something like the picture that's up right now, the Farewell Till We Meet Again, I would assume that's a limestone. It's a fairly fine grain and possibly does come from somewhere around Springdale. When it comes to the quarrying of stone, we're talking about outcroppings. They didn't have the kinds of quarries that you see in New England with the big pit quarries. But around Yardell, or actually around Highway 7, between the Irby Road and then heading towards Harrison, Dogpatch area, there was a quarry at one time that was so famous for its stone that people came there just to get slabs of stone for tombstones. Nick Miller was one of the ones who came there with a handful of orders from people in Berryville that wanted that stone. It was a dusty rose color, and it was the same stone that Arkansas sent to Washington for its contribution to the Washington Monument. So that quarry had a reputation, and people wanted it for their tombstones too. So that would be an example of stone that got moved quite a distance because they wanted it from that particular area.
Okay, you have time for a couple of more, Abby?
Sure, why not?
Okay. Do you need permission to go to these places that you shared with us?
Technically, no, but I sure would not go past a locked gate that had a no trespassing sign. The law in Arkansas says you are not allowed to keep somebody out of a cemetery. And I've been to one in Newton County, has a big sign that says no trespassing except for cemetery visitors, which is a nice way to have it both ways. You can't trespass, but you can go to the cemetery. That said, if someone's going to keep you off, I don't think there's much you can do about it. You really should get permission, and never clean a stone without someone's permission. So.
Yeah, very good. Here's just a tidbit from one of the audience. The Trails Illustrated maps have many of the cemeteries marked. I found all mentioned in this talk on the map. So a Trails Illustrated map.
Oh, that's good to know. Thank you.
Now I'm just going down the list. So don't do this yet, Abby. They're wanting to know if we can go back to, well, I guess we can go back to your slide that has a map on it so they can take a picture of the screen.
Sure, absolutely. That's the last one. Yeah, that'd be the best one that lists all the cemeteries. Hasty is not red, but Hasty would be the other, and Mossville is off of the map. So Mossville's not there, and Hasty is right near the Hasty canoe launch.
Okay, and while folks are looking at that, are there many or any white bronze markers in this region, the region you talked about today?
Not that I know of anywhere in Newton County. White bronze is basically pure zinc, and it's a bluish color. We have a few around Fayetteville. Jasper City Cemetery does not have any. No, there might be some around Harrison, but again, none of the cemeteries on this tour. All of these cemeteries are fairly isolated, and people were using the materials they had readily available. White bronze would have to be shipped in. You'd have to have a dealer, a way to order it, a way to get it to you, and you'd have to have the money for it. And so, no, I don't know of any white bronze in this area.
All right, two more. If I have a relative buried in an active cemetery, but there is no marker, and I believe the reference is to Temperance Hill Cemetery, this person was born in 1753. Is there a chance to find those old records?
I wish there were old records. I just attended a Zoom lecture yesterday that was coming out of Maine, and they were talking about tombstones, and they had everything on paper. They had letters, they had diaries, and I was salivating. Unfortunately, no. Even the cemeteries on this tour where there's a church there, to my knowledge, there are no records. They weren't saved, or they burned up. Courthouses didn't keep them. I think you could put a marker in a cemetery that says so-and-so was known to be buried here, or near this spot is the grave of. I have seen that done, where you want to acknowledge the person, but you don't know where they are. But as far as actual records, I do not know of any cemetery that has them, other than, say, Evergreen in Fayetteville has some. But these isolated, these smaller ones, not to my knowledge.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. All right, the final question, which is a good one to end. Will this recording be available? And yes, Abby has given her gracious consent to let us put this recording on our YouTube channel. So we will get it edited. And if you just look for Shiloh Museum on YouTube, it will be there within the next couple of weeks. Abby, thank you, as always, inspiring, interesting. Thank you for all you're doing to preserve our history, especially where it comes to these local cemeteries. You are working on a book, statewide book about Arkansas cemeteries, correct?
Yes, thank you. I'm still writing. Unfortunately, I left a really messy chapter for the last, and I'm struggling. But I spent 3 years driving all over Arkansas looking for the most unusual stones with the best stories. And so there are unusual carvings and sculptures and stories, but I have to say my favorite story, and I'm so proud of this, is there is a grave in Arkansas where the man's grave is marked with the murder weapon that killed him.
Wow.
And nobody has the story. No one has written about it. And I have the whole story, and he had it coming. He definitely, I gotta say, deserved it. But the object used to smash in his skull is the thing that marks his grave. He has no tombstone. He has a piece of a Ford axle.
Oh my gosh. Okay, so y'all stay tuned to hear the rest of that story when Abby's book comes out. That is fabulous.
Thank you for asking about that, Susan.
Oh, you bet. I've got it on my ready to buy book list whenever it's out. All right. Well, with that, we will wish you all a happy afternoon. Abby, again, you're getting many, many thank yous and
Thank you to everyone who
appreciations. And we will, to keep up with the Shiloh Museum, just go to our website, shilohmuseum.org, or you can even pick up the phone and call us, 750-8165. All right. Y'all have a great afternoon, and we look forward to seeing you soon.